Well, welcome to this week's episode of The Deep Dive, where we are in our teaching series. It runs in the family, looking at what it means to be the church, what we are called to be. And today we are looking at the theme of serve one another. As the church, we are called to serve one another. I am Brad. I serve our online ministries, joined today by Pastor Terry and Pastor Chris. How you guys doing? Terry, you just got back from vacation. How was that?
Vacation a week ago. Oh, it was fantastic. We drove out to the California coast, so we had a great time.
Did Highway 1.
Did Highway 1 from San Francisco down to LA, which is my favorite place on the planet, I think.
Now, you said you drove to the California.
The only way we could afford to do it is to drive. So, yes, we had a lot of miles to get there, but it's well worth the drive. Yeah.
Chris, how are you doing today? How's stuff going out in St. Charles?
Yeah, stuff at St. Charles is going well. Fall's my favorite season. Football's around the corner. All good things are coming. Yes, excited.
Well, today we are, like I said, looking at this idea of what it looks like to serve one another, why that's something that we as Christians are commanded to do. And then what that looks like in our unique context in the local church. But before we kind of dive into a couple of the passages, I want to ask the relationship between love one another and serve one another, because especially in the Galatians passage we're looking at, both of those things show up. And I feel like love has shown up in multiple of the weeks. So I guess.
Yeah, I think as we kind of mentioned the first week, that love is kind of the overarching theme. It's the same really. We'll get to it a little bit later in Galatians when we do that in the fall, but the fruit of the Spirit is love. All these other things are sometimes the byproducts of love. So I think, how we bear with one another, forgive one another, encourage one another, teach one another, and serve one another comes out of love. It's how we express that real love that's there. It takes something that can seem a little intangible and puts some legs to it.
Yeah, faith, hope, and love. The greatest of these is love. So if that is expressed through a lot of different ways, obedience, service, like being two of the biggest ways. Obedience shows the love and the faithfulness towards God, and I think service, yes, vertical, but service is very horizontal in the way that we show love to the church and those outside the church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's why we started, right, this series with love one another. Probably more than any of these others, love one another is the one that most frequently shows up in the New Testament.
And I think it shows the heart and the motivation of why we do things. You can serve, as we talk, you could serve begrudgingly. You can serve because you have to. People know what it's like to be served when someone doesn't want to do that. I mean, when someone's throwing you a plate of food at a restaurant or something, and you don't, there's not a lot of care. And I think Paul is just emphasizing that too. This is how we love, but it's an opportunity to really check our heart. How is our heart? Jesus did not go to the cross begrudgingly for us. He went because God so loved the world, and, that we are to model that service and that serving, loving heart to others.
That's great. Okay, well, so we're in Galatians chapter 5, verses 13, and then there's a couple other verses to follow. Chris, out at St. Charles, is that where you were this weekend as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Just want to make sure that, as we get started, that I don't know, last week, I felt bad because we had two. We had 1 Thessalonians, we had James. We only had a couple minutes left for James to get that there at the end. So Galatians chapter 5, I'm just going to read verses 13, 14, and 15. And then there's a few ideas I want to unpack, especially from verse 13. And we do have a Galatians series coming up. And so we'll spend more time with many of these themes. But I think we can talk about some stuff here that we probably won't as much in that series. So, Galatians chapter 5, starting in verse 13. Paul writes this, "For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another." So we'll start in verse 13, and then especially there's a couple things in verse 15 that we could probably hit on as well. But in verse 13, so he starts, "For you were called to freedom, brothers." This idea of calling, right? It says you were called. I think we see calling show up in different ways to mean different things throughout the New Testament. We use this phrase often. Almost to justify, I think, things that we want to do. I feel God calling me to do this. What is this idea, this biblical idea of calling? And then, so big picture, and then specifically here, how is Paul using it?
So I think calling is where your wiring and skill set and design intersect with the soil in which God has planted you. Like at that intersection is calling. And this can be affirmed by the need of those who call you. This can be affirmed through God opening doors where there would not otherwise be open doors. But I do think we lend ourselves to folly if we're expecting like the burning bush in our front yard, or we are expecting a grandiose, miraculous sign, like our initials written in the clouds or something of like, oh, this is your calling. When in reality, it's probably just going to lean more into how did God design us? Where has he placed us? And then what doors has he opened? And if all three of those boxes are checked and it feels great in our prayer life and our spirit, go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's this specific, he calls us to specific things. You see throughout the Old Testament, New Testament, God calls people to specific things. He calls us all to some general things too, where there's an invitation. John the Baptist's voice of one calling in the world, inviting people, and that there's this invitation. And this is what we'll spend a lot of time in Galatians talking about, the invitation to the freedom we have. And the church in Galatia, was going off rails. And one of the things Paul wants to do in Galatians is tell us how to identify false teaching and help us to defend true teaching. So it's an invitation that we're not invited. We're invited to a freedom in God. We're invited not to bondage of trying to do better, try harder, hit all the spiritual marks to be able to get to God, but that we're invited into this very intimate, profound relationship where God gives us the freedom to walk out that relationship with him, and obviously to use that freedom well to serve others.
So kind of things I'm hearing: invitation, God initiating. There's this idea of movement, a response, right? That's even required. I do wonder though, kind of in light of even like Romans 8, right? You've been called. Those he called, he's predestined. Those he's predestined, right? You have this kind of what version of calling, right, is in scope there.
Yeah. And serve one another.
No. Sorry. In bigger picture, right? Okay. When God calls,
yes.
What is our responsibility?
Yeah.
Is that making sense?
Yeah. So I think adoption is like a really good word to use when we talk about how we are called out of our past, of our sin, of the broken and fallen state in which we lived. So when we're adopted into the family, then the responsibility for us is to reciprocate by then living in such a way that identifies with that family, right? So it's not just having the gospel doctrine, it's having the gospel culture, like it's having the healthy family values permeate the system in the family, the brothers and sisters of all tongues, tribes, and nations. Yeah.
Is it fair to connect calling and like God's sovereignty, right? Are those two things related?
Yeah, I mean, I think to Terry's earlier point, there's specific callings and there's general callings. So love God, love people, make disciples, love one another, serve one another. Like, none of these we get to opt out. Like, these are all crucial threads that are going to run through God's plan for our lives in this era and then going into the new heavens and the new earth. So within that, there's ones we can't opt out of, and there's then the specific callings that we have a little bit of room to move about the cabin, but we have some freedom to, like, okay, serve one another. I can't opt out of that, but how I serve, maybe I do have some agency in that, right? So I have agency within that framework, and God's going to work all of this together. He's going to weave it all in the tapestry that's going to be the bigger story. If that makes sense. Yeah.
So in this verse, called to freedom, right? To freedom, that's the indirect object, advantage there. That's an interesting thing to be called to, right? Like, what is Paul talking about here when he's talking about freedom? Because I think that in the American church, especially, right, in the USA, right, we love freedom. I think we often connect American liberty, freedom to freedom that is found in the New Testament, because it's the same word, right? Yeah. So what else could be, he talking about?
Well, there's always the challenge, and this is what we'll spend some time in Galatians talking about. It's the fine line between legalism, following certain rules, doing certain things. This is why they're biting, devouring each other. You have to do this and speak this way and go to this service and pray this way and, follow all these rules. There's this legalism versus liberty, which is freedom to a great extent. That freedom is really the opportunity to not be imprisoned. Freedom is not being imprisoned by false legal thing, not being imprisoned falsely. It's being, free to be who we are in God. And Paul is doing this. The problem in Galatia is they were moving back to how do you follow Jesus, and here's all the rules and regulations and all the things you have to do, which was so oppressive, and you had no freedom, no joy in that. Obviously, there are people who, well, I accept Jesus and I'm just going to live my own. Paul ignores, says that's not good too, but it's how to live in the freedom, in the relationship of what to do. And in that freedom, out of loving God, we're free to love God, respond to God who has served us. The way that we serve him is through practically serving other people, those who are close. So we're free to be able to do that. I mean, I don't think, it's so oppressive if we have to live our life like, okay, who does God call me to serve? Who's the one person I'm supposed to serve? And I better find the right person. And that's probably part of what was going on there. It's like, I'm free to serve. I'm free to follow the Spirit of God. God calls me to serve. I'm gonna serve out of love and see who God calls me to today.
Yeah, I mean, I think piggyback off that, liberty is one if not the greatest values, like underpinning values of American culture. Yeah. And that is not true of the Bible.
Say more about that.
Yeah. So let's look at Paul. What's he call himself? A doulos, a servant. Okay. That's interesting. That doesn't seem like the most liberty thing. Covenantal love. Well, if we were designed for pure unrestrained liberty, we could just leave the covenant at any point with no recourse. Yeah. And so we breathe and we swim in the value of unrestrained liberty. And if you are going to infringe on my liberty at any point, that is an unkindness or an evil. So this is an Americanism. This cannot be found in the Bible.
Yeah. No, that's good. And that's hard, right?
Yeah.
It's hard because what we want it to mean is I can do whatever I want, whenever I want it, and no one else can tell me anything otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why I think the scripture was called license, right? That it's all about me and what I want, and I can do that. Biblical liberty is really out of my relationship with God, the calling, Paul, that there's a slave, and then the idea of a bondservant where someone willingly chooses out of love for their master to serve them. And that's, very much the biblical image that we're not obligated to serve, but we choose out of love because the master has been so kind and served us that we want to spend our life serving the master.
Yeah. So within the Christian framework, like love one another as yourself. So in that framework, it's actually not designed for you to act upon the liberty to hate your neighbor.
Right.
Yeah.
Like that's actually intentional.
Yeah.
On purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I love how Paul starts this verse here. For you were called to freedom, brothers, right? So there's God's sovereign, right? God has initiated, he's invited action for the purpose of, to the end of our freedom, right? God initiates a relationship with us for the purpose of freeing us. Yeah. And what's going to follow is a command that Paul gives. But in between there, he uses the word brothers. And so he's grounding all of this in just this very familial, relational language, because it's Paul's going to give a command. He's not above the command, right? He is including himself in that. And actually, even in writing this, he's probably got what he is doing in mind as he is serving this group. And then so he goes on, he says, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. So let's ground it on this serve word. Obviously, you guys both spoke on it this weekend. Simply speaking, what does it mean to serve someone else? And then in the scope of this series, we're using the one another's. So within the church, why is it important to serve one another in the church? And then is there a distinction between serving those inside the church and serving those in the community around us?
Okay, so that's five questions.
That's a lot of questions. Yes.
Well, I think, basically serving is probably simply seeing a need and meeting it. Is there a need and meeting it? And, fascinated by this Old Testament story of David in the wilderness. He was being hunted down. He's outside of Bethlehem. The Philistines have surrounded Bethlehem. He's near there. He has some sort of moment of reflection where, it was his hometown. He's like, I just would love a drink of water from the well. Like, I'd love just a drink. Yeah. It probably brings back memories. That's his hometown. It's like, it's so good. It's like I used to live in California. It's like, I just want to go see the ocean again. There's something nostalgic about that. And so a couple of these mighty men, right? I don't think David was commanding them but a couple of these mighty men, they sneak in, they go through the garrison, they, seek through the Philistines, give him some water. Yeah. And then David's like, it's realizing how they had served him. He's like, I'm not even worthy of it. This is worship to God, and he pours it out as a drink offering to God. But I think that's what if we lived in that? It's like, it wasn't a desperate need. It wasn't like he was going to die, but out of love for people, it's like, okay, someone has a need, someone has a desire even, I'm going to meet that. And I think we do that reciprocally in the church. So seeing a need, seeing a desire, like that. And meeting that.
Meeting needs. Yeah. Meeting the needs of someone else. Yeah.
No, it's good. I mean, we're always going to have needs in the church. Mm-hmm. And our city's always going to have needs that the church can step into, kind of more outside the walls. So I think both of those, if either one of those get neglected, then I think you end up in an unhealthy place.
Mm-hmm. 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 For sure. So Paul here in this verse, it's a command, right? It's an imperative. I think often we look at imperatives as suggestions, and then it's easier. It feels good. We even can find ways to justify it, right? But what do we do with this as a command? Like how, whenever you're preaching these texts like these, talking to the body, how do we speak about the commands of God in a way that's winsome and inspiring? Because every month we have there's ways to serve, right? It shows up in our weekly email. It shows up on our digital displays. It shows up in, different places in promotion. It feels weird to tell people what to do. And yet it's the role of the pastor, preacher to do that. And it's not obviously you telling them, it's explaining the words. So, yeah.
And I think it's a challenge. I mean, I think that's the preaching challenge is like every week we can guilt somebody into something else. You know, there's more than enough command. I mean, even over the last while, you know, looking at all these commands that I think the one another's are commands, they're not suggested. This one, it does, you know, what does the church need? How do people feel apart? How do they serve one another? I mean, I think one of the mysterious elements of the whole one another series is that it's not, well, you go and serve. It's also, you've got to be served, which Paul does. You know, many of his letters, as people have given him gifts, they've sent money, they've sent people to help him, they've served him, and he's served. There's a reciprocal nature of that. And I think that's part of, are we willing to be served and to serve at the same time? And where do we find that out? And of course, the church needs people to serve, you know, to build the infrastructure so the church can really reach and become who God has called us to be. We need people who are serving. So it is a challenge. Yeah, it's not optional. It's not, you know, what is God calling you to do here?
Yeah, and I think the irony is sometimes we can feel like, man, I don't want to feel like the guy that's just asking people for something. But ironically, I think
people see through that.
Right. Yeah.
Right. They don't want to just be used.
Right. But I think ironically, there are people that are waiting to be called to more. Like they're stagnant, like they're stuck, like they actually want to be called to more. They want to be given opportunity. I mean, at St. Charles campus, we're so small, I just get to use the excuse of, which is legitimate, like we're so small, like we need you. Like we have, right?
If you don't do this, it's not getting done.
Right. We need every like hand on deck, you know? So, yeah.
Yeah, and maybe we sometimes, you know, we're going to do something later this fall just to thank and celebrate our volunteers and people who have served, you know, and there are people who serve, you know, I think, you know, our whole youth ministry, right, it's people who have been leaders for students from 6th grade through 12th grade. I mean, that's 7 years these volunteers have faithfully been with kids. Like, that's something to celebrate, and that's a major thing. Probably people need a bit of a break after that. You know, people give up their vacations. I know people use their vacation time to go to summer camp to be with these youth, like what people do. But obviously, the sense of value and the reward of what God has done, you know, is what Paul says in Ephesians 2:10. You know, we are God's workmanship, created for good services, for good work. God's created us for things. And as part, you know, it really is loving to invite someone into a serving opportunity so they can experience that and use their gifts. And it is so true. Sometimes people are waiting, you know, for that invitation.
And that's a great, you know, Sarah, I'm glad you used the word gifts. What's the relationship between gifts and serving? Right? Does there have to be, like, whether it's a spiritual gift or a natural gift, or are there things that just, I mean, we hate to use the expression, you just need a warm body, but there are some things that you just need people, right? So, yeah.
Well, I think if you have a spiritual gifting and it's never being used, I don't think you're ever going to live in the fullness of, like, who you were designed and created to be. Not only like you yourself as an individual, but even more importantly within the covenant community, the people of God. And so there's talents and there's spiritual gifts. These are different, but we want to use both of them. Like having a beautiful singing voice, right? That's not a spiritual gift. But like we want you to use that talent. And so I think when we're using the things God has given us and the ways designed us to the utmost, that's when we feel most alive. You know, like a Christmasism, right? Is like, it's better to give than to receive, right? We hear that all the time. Christian and non-Christians use this. Well,
I really like receiving.
We really like receiving.
Yeah.
But it does feel great to serve and to give. Like there's that sense of, I don't know if it's accomplishment or just like being who we were created to be, but it's not just true for Christmas. Like all year round, there is truth into the kind of cliche of it is better to give than to receive. Yeah.
Yeah, I think again, as the general specific, we're all called to share our faith. But some people have a spiritual gift of sharing their faith. That's a spiritual gift. So some can equip or teach or help people do that. But we don't say, well, I'm not going to share because I'm not gifted. That the Bible doesn't give us that out. We're invited to serve and share in a number of different ways. But sometimes there is a sweet spot, or there's a place where we really experience God's favor in our life when we work in the area of giftedness that He's given us.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. Well, I want to ask you guys about something else in verse 15. We have a couple minutes. I feel like this is Paul being prophetic in a way, or maybe it's just people being people and church being church. But verse 15, but if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. Obviously, he has something specific in scope here. But, man, if you're on Twitter, if you're around the Christian larger culture, we see Christians hurting one another, right? There's stories that, coming out of Mars Hill and Willow Creek and some of these kind of like really prominent churches, but there's also stories coming out of smaller churches that don't get told, but we've all heard them. What do we do? What do we do with this?
Yeah, I think this is, the church was imploding in Galatia because it was becoming divided, a different group, kind of people who wanted to go back to more Jewish traditions, Gentiles and others who experienced their freedom. So I'm right, you're wrong, you have to follow me, this is the way it is. I think there was a lot of biting and devouring, what happens. And it eventually just does implode. You become consumed by it all. And so I think that's the important part of the one another. How do we look at, if we see people by their political party or by a particular secular aspect, we are always going to feel like we're enemies, as opposed to we see people as in the image of God, as their image bearers, as Christ is in them, that God is using them. They're part of what God is using me to love and encourage one another. Am I willing to listen to them because Christ is in at least? Doesn't mean we agree, doesn't mean that we can't share, but I think it's, the noise of our culture is just, we're talking over each other and nobody's listening, but am I willing to love, honor, respect, bear with, forgive, and, next week pray with one another?
Yeah, I think to truly be one who serves, you have to love and care for people who are outside of your tribe. And we have become so tribal that that is very difficult. And it grieves all of us. I wish I could sit here and say, like, the church is less divisive than the culture. It's not. We have taken the idol from their sanctuary and we've put it in ours.
And that's not easy. It's hard. People that we may fundamentally disagree with or see something different than us. I think we have opportunities in our culture to be able to share and say, here's what I feel, here's what I believe. But it's when we start seeing them as enemies and cancel them and write them off, or you're an evil person, then it's just going to come back and consume us.
Good stuff, guys. Thanks for this conversation. This whole series I've really enjoyed. Just as we've talked, often it's easy to look at the things and the ways that the church doesn't measure up or stand up. But I think the reminders of the good things, the positive things, the things that we want the church to be known for has been it's been an encouragement to me. And so hopefully it's been an encouragement to our church as well. Again, thank you guys for joining us for this week's deep dive as we talked about what it looks like to serve one another and the importance of that. Next week, as Terry mentioned, we're going to be talking about praying with and for one another. And so look forward to that conversation next week. Hope you guys have a great week.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive, a Calvary Church Media Productions podcast. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts.